Better. Good afternoon, Your Honours, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. There's an odd student or so. Welcome, potential lawyers in the future. On Monday afternoon, we had a wonderful tour at the Parthenon Museum. And if you recall, at the end of the tour, we're taken to see the east pediment of the Parthenon, where they depicted the battle, the Gigantomachy, and I want you to note that word, Gigantomachy. It was a mythical battle between the Olympian gods and the giants. As we all know, the gods, particularly Athena, prevailed over the giants. The symbol or the message that that victory designated was the prevalence of something that our keynote speaker, Chief Justice Gagler, noted of order, rational logos over chaos. As lawyers, we welcome usually another interpretation. And as with me today, I have some incredible giants, intellectual giants. No, I have formidable female intellectual giants as our panelists. They will address you on the topic of μαθαίνοντας από την αρχαία Αθήνα για την προστασία της σύγχρονων δημοκρατιών. They will address us on learning from ancient Athens to protect modern democracies. Our first speaker is the Honourable Anthe Philippides, SC. She is the Queensland patron of the Hellenic Australian Lawyers Association. She's an adjunct professor at the TC Burns School of Law and a member of the Australian Academy of Law, a former justice of the Supreme Court of Queensland, and prior to her appointment, she served over a decade as the Honorary Vice Consul of Brisbane for the Republic of Cyprus, and there's a strong Cypriot connection. Her contribution in the law spans for more than 40 years. She was the first woman of Hellenic heritage to be admitted as a barrister of Queensland and to attain the rank of senior counsel in Australia. Her appointment to the Supreme Court in 2000 and then the Court of Appeal in 2014 marked the appointment of the first woman of immigrant parents in Australia and the first appointment of a woman proudly of the Cypriot diaspora to serve at those levels of the judiciary worldwide. She served on many law bodies, the first woman president of the Maritime Law Association of Australia and New Zealand. On her retirement after more than 20 years as a judge, she was conferred honorary doctorates from the University of Queensland, the Queensland University of Technology, and honorary life membership by the Women's Lawyers Association. She has combined her legal career with a lifetime support of advocacy of the arts, First Nations people, diversity and inclusion. Interesting, she serves as a chair of the Flying Arts Alliance, a regional arts organisation, and has served on the boards of Musica Viva Australia, Queensland Youth Orchestra, and the University of Queensland Press. Please welcome the Honourable Anthe Philippides.
It's a great pleasure to be here today, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Over 2,500 years ago, a debate began here in the ancient Athenian city-state about how human affairs ought to be governed to promote a harmonious way of life for the common good. The Athenians settled on a political order they called demokratia. The difference between the Athenian and modern democracy model is understood as the difference between direct and representative democracy. The latter is an 18th century construct influenced by the Roman Republican model, And while the Athenian model was rejected as undesirable mob rule, the Athenian word demokratia still had cachet in its association with liberty that saw it repurposed by engrafting the concept of representation with the consent of the majority. In our modern times, democracy is under threat, and the very meaning of democracy is contested, with some seeing it as merely concerned with process, a free and fair electoral process. But others, notably the renowned political scientist Josiah Ober, see the Athenian model of democracy as pointing to answers that look beyond such processes to underlying values that still have pertinence. The first thing to observe about Athenian democracy is that its political power sharing was revolutionary. Under Timokratia, Kratos was concerned with political power of the polis. And Athenians came to a view of who should exercise that power that rejected any reservation of power for a monarch or elite, replacing it with the concept of the demos as constituted by the people of the polis, irrespective of their status or wealth. Understood as a concept of political rule on the premise that we are all in this together and governed together, irrespective of status, Athenian democracy was indeed radical. But there was a rider. Political equality did not extend beyond male citizens, so excluded women and slaves. Athenian political exceptionalism did not extend to revolutionizing gender norms nor attitudes to slavery, commonplace in ancient times and still well entrenched in the 18th century human rights era in which modern democracies emerged. The story of Athenian democracy starts at the beginning of the 6th century, a time of large-scale social dysfunction stemming from extreme inequalities of wealth, aristocratic factionalism, and corruption. The Athenians took the approach of appointing Solon as archon with wide law reform powers to address these issues. Solon's most important reform was to prohibit the practice of citizens trading personal liberty as collateral for loans, which rendered the debtor the property of the creditor on default, a practice consented to by the desperate poor and exploited by the rich. This reform, known as the throwing off of the shackles, took effect retrospectively, cancelling debts and freeing those enslaved. It embedded in the Athenian psyche and law the ideal of liberty attaching to citizenship. That ideal and the rule of law as of equal application were two values foundational to Athenian democracy. But Solon was no democrat. His notion of equal justice did not translate to equal political power. It's the reforms of Cleisthenes some 90 years later, towards the end of the 6th century, that many see as putting political power in the hands of the people so as to mark the start of Athenian democracy. And he did this by transforming the tribal system, introducing a very important unit called the deme, a self-governing local community unit, sometimes called grassroots democracy. And as part of the infrastructure that was altered, reforming the power of the assembly and introducing a new political executive body, the Council of 500, that acted as a executive of the assembly. These reforms were far-reaching in a new alignment of citizens with geographical and socio-economic diversity that cut across the kinship and ties of the aristocratic elite and brought together people to build a cohesive governmental organisation with tremendous diversity. Less than 20 years later, the nascent Athenian democracy faced its first existential threat at the Battle of Marathon. That famous victory in the Persian Wars revealed a citizenry fully committed to its new democracy and reflected the important roles played by the Assembly and the new council. For example, the decision to develop Athens as a naval power and to evacuate the city before the Battle of Salamis. The phrase, "Edoxe dodemoi," the people decided, became the official imprimatur of a resolution passed by the Assembly. Competition for supremacy between Athens and Sparta resulted in the Peloponnesian Wars. However, even during this prolonged period of warfare, key democratic reforms continued. Ephialtes, a radical democrat supported by Pericles, reformed the last bastion of aristocratic power, the Areopagus, transferring its power as guardian of the laws to the People's Court. The digasteria, which were now courts of first instance and appeal. And under Pericles' leadership, further democratic reforms were made, importantly, broadening adoption of sortition for public office and introducing pay for public service, which facilitated participation by the poor. Pericles' death from the plague in 429 BCE, just 2 years after the start of the Second Peloponnesian War, brought instability for the Athenian democracy. During the remainder of the 5th century, oligarchic coups twice overtook democracy, but only for short periods in 411 after the disastrous Sicilian campaign and in 404 on Athens' defeat by Sparta. The latter, known as the Rule of the 30, was a very bloody period. It saw 1,500 citizens out of a citizen body of 25,000 executed over an 8-month period. So, what were the values important to Athenian democracy? Pericles' funeral oration, Epidaphos Logos, delivered in 431, as recorded by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian Wars, is a good starting place. Its context and purpose is important. It was given in the grueling first year of the Second Peloponnesian Wars, and Pericles was seeking to inspire his fellow Athenians by reinforcing not only that Athens' democratic system was superior to that of Sparta, but that it was worth protecting and indeed dying for. Pericles did this by breaking with tradition, which was to eulogize past glories, and instead he said, "What I want to do is to discuss our constitution and the way of life." And then after doing that, he emphasizes, "This then is the kind of city for which the fallen, who could not bear the thought of losing her, nobly fought and died." Well, whether the oration is that of Pericles or an embellished version by Thucydides, and notwithstanding the propaganda element that was involved, it remains a powerful portrait of what mattered to Athenians in terms of democratic values that were deeply held. The two core values of Athenian democracy are equality and freedom. For Athenians, they were intertwined. To be free was to be equal, to be subservient to no master. These ideals are celebrated throughout the oration in Pericles' advocacy for Athenian democracy. Equality encompassed political equality, isokratia, and legal equality, isonomia. Freedom, eleutheria, was a democratic value that encompassed a cultural way of life that allowed the freedom for political participation and a private life free from oppression. Turning first to political equality, Pericles starts the oration by pointing to the Athenian government as novel, stating our system of government does not copy our neighbours, but is an example to them. And identifying it in this way, it is true that we are called a democracy because the power is in the hands of the many, not the few. And implicit in this definition was that political power, not being in the hands of few, is superior as a form of governance because it is exercised in the general interest rather than the interest of the few. Its central tenet was that no elite had a monopoly over political wisdom and that the political judgment of the ordinary citizen was as trustworthy as any other and collectively more likely to be right. The value of collective decision making was acknowledged by Aristotle, stating, "There is this to be said for the many. Each of them by himself may or may not be of good quality, but when they come together, it is possible that they may surpass collectively, as a body, although not individually, the quality of the best few. For when there are many, each has his share of goodness and practical wisdom." The value of the collective as a decision-making model is reflected in Jeremy Waldron's doctrine of the wisdom of the multitude, and a version of it is reflected in Condorcet's jury theorem. And it's worth noting that in our modern democracies, it is only in the third arm of government, in the justice system, and only in the institution of the jury, where direct citizen participation in decision-making can be found. For Athenians, political equality came with civic responsibility. This brings me to another value prized by the Athenians, the voluntary civic participation in the affairs of the polis. Pericles remarks on this as a unique feature of Athenian democracy. We alone, he says, judge the person who has no share in da politica to be not merely a man who minds his own business, but one who has no business here at all. Such a person was only interested in self, idios. And active participation promoted another value, an open society which privileged transparency and accountability. Pericles says, our city is open to the world, pointing to another benefit of an open society, that it reflected a confidence in the governmental process and capacity to meet external threats. In terms of legal equality, Pericles says in his oration, in settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. And he emphasises the importance of the rule of law. In public affairs, we keep to the law, he says, because it demands our deep respect. And Pericles included in this reference to the law the unwritten laws, which it is an acknowledged shame to break. Athenian democracy grappled with the intersection of law and morality. An important exploration of this is found in Antigone. In burying her brother in defiance of the king's decree, Antigone relies on a higher moral law, the immutable unwritten laws of heaven. The notion of justice having divine origin is reflected in the debate contrasting nomos, man-made law, and physis, nature, examined by Aristotle in Rhetoric. And he expressly links Antigone's act as being just by nature, and so by universal natural law. That question raised in Antigone of what is a just law and whether civil disobedience of an unjust law is justified is one that has continued to be asked in democracies. It is one Martin Luther King posed when justifying his own civil disobedience in his letter from the Birmingham jail. And the question of whether principles of morality form part of the concept of law have been a central part of the jurisprudential question of the modern era, Hart, Rawls, Dworkin, and many others. And it is a mark of the exceptionalism of Athenian democracy that this type of challenging contemplation could be countenanced. In terms of the value of liberty, a very strong feature of the oration is the many references to freedom as a way of life for Athenians. Pericles describes the Athenian citizen as eleftheros in both the private domain, daidira, and the public sphere, dademosia. And he neatly summarizes this by saying, just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life in our relations with each other. And he was sure to contrast the freedom enjoyed by Athenians with the extreme regimentation of Spartan life. In a famous passage, Pericles links happiness, eudaimonia, with freedom, and freedom with courage. This was not just rhetorical flourish, but an articulation of recent lived experience. Only 30 years earlier, Athenians defended their democracy against the tyranny of the 30. Oswin Murray observes in The Muse of History that all history is and has always been written in and for the present and is valid only as a myth for the present or a stepping stone towards the future. This is true of the concept of liberty. In this context, Benjamin Constant, in his very famous essay on the liberty of the ancient compared to modern liberty, sought to distinguish ancient and modern liberty by drawing on the distinction between direct and representative democracy. Ancient democracy and liberty, he said, was focused on the exercise of political power, whereas modern democracy and liberty was concerned with personal freedom, because representation relieved people from being burdened by the chores of governance. Isaiah Berlin built on this by reframing liberty as two concepts: positive liberty, freedom to act, and negative liberty, freedom from interference. In the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek quotes as an example of the modern concept of liberty John Locke's celebrated statement, "The end of the law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom, for liberty is to be free from restraint from others." Hayek thought that this modern concept couldn't really be traced back beyond the 17th century, but he did think the Athenians knew of this type of liberty, citing Pericles' statement, "The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. We're far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other. We do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbour for doing what he likes." The personal liberty that Athenian democracy protected was not based on liberalism, nor constitutional rights, nor inalienable human rights. Their private freedom was interlinked and preserved through the exercise of their public freedom to participate directly in politics. In terms of the concept of public or positive liberty, freedom too, Athenians apprised above all the freedom of political participation, but it was intimately connected to two types of positive freedoms of speech: isagoria, equal political speech, and parrhesia, fearless, frank speech. They combined to inform the view that the best decisions and policies were achieved through open and frank debate in which all could participate. As Pericles observed, the worst thing is to rush into action before the consequences have been properly debated. In Suppliants, Euripides has Theseus, the mythical king of Athens, refer to the herald's summons at the opening of debate at the Athenian Assembly to define freedom as isagoria and to link it with equality in this way. Freedom lies in this formula. Who has good counsel which he wishes to offer the city? Who desires to speak wins fame. He who does not remains silent. Where could greater liberty be found? The other freedom of speech, parousia, required courage and had consequences if the advice turned out to be harmful to the polis. Michel Foucault famously analysed the interaction between parousia and democracy and how it could be problematic where bad parousia was practiced. Plato was not too keen on its use by ordinary people. In Free Speech, Timothy Garton Ash looked at the modern relevance of these Athenian concepts of free speech. He points to a triple linkage between democracy, free speech, and good governance as a central tenet of modern democracies. He argues that freedom of political speech and dissent and courage in its advancement and its association with liberty are a key part of the traditional value set of democracies that can be traced back to ancient Athens. And he refers to a 1927 concurring judgment of the great American jurist Justice Brandeis in Whitney and California, recognized as one of the most influential in American free speech jurisprudence. Brandeis established a democratic foundation for American free speech jurisprudence based on his understanding of Athenian democratic principles and practice. In considering the state's power to curtail constitutionally enshrined rights like freedom of speech, Brandeis looked to the guiding principle of liberty, writing, "Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty." Well, you've heard that before. And many point to this belief, although being imputed to the founding fathers, is in fact mirroring Pericles' funeral oration. And Brandeis also attributes other values as guiding the founding fathers, which in fact echo the Athenian concepts of isagoria and parousia and the opprobrium felt for the idiots. Speaking of the founding fathers, he says, they believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think, you might think this is parousia, a means indisputable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech, assembly discussion would be futile. This can be understood as isagoria, and that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Our representational style of democracy raises the obvious question, alien to the direct democracy model of the ancient Greeks. Who will guard the guardian? How is trust and integrity in such a system to be maintained? The question is generally answered as Garton Ash does in his book. There's no single key, but rather an awkward, uncomfortable, shifting combination of checks and balances, with the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, all having a part to play together with the media. But Václav Havel, the famous Czech dissident and president of the Czech Republic who oversaw the peaceful transition to democracy, observed that the best laws and best conceived democratic mechanisms will not in themselves guarantee legality or freedom or human rights if they are not underpinned by certain human and social values. He warned that the obstacles facing modern democracies will periodically tempt people to conclude that political life, viewed realistically, is chiefly the manipulation of power and public opinion, and that morality has no place in it. James Miller, in his book, Can Democracy Work? A Short History of a Radical Idea from Ancient Athens to Our World, builds on Havel's observations, arguing that the loss of belief in the in the transformative force of the values of truth, the strength of a free spirit, conscience, and responsibility results in a demoralized view of democracy. Miller argues if we abandon a virtue like truthfulness, we put at risk a public sphere created in part by acknowledging a shared reality and a handful of core common values over and above the hall of mirrors constructed by competing political parties and the rival worldviews they propagate. In The Retreat of Western Liberalism, Edward Luce argues part of the cause of the decline of optimism post 1989 was the erosion of the public's trust that societies were indeed all in this together, which is the invisible referendum of the social contract. Such a loss of trust risks democracy being seen as rule either by a self-interested elite or the tyranny of the majority, and is a corruption of the original Athenian understanding of the demos as a collective able to effect political change through debate. Ober has written extensively of what can be learned from the Athenian democratic model to promote the efficient aggregation and dissemination of knowledge across governmental bodies. He emphasizes the concept of moral reciprocity, which aligned the interests of the individual with those of the collective through participatory practices. Others have focused on how political power can be exercised for the collective good through deliberative practices that promote public discourse in the decisional process through civic engagement. The idea of the common good as a civic value is a good question to examine in our era of technological revolution and AI. It's explored by Jamie Susskind in The Digital Republic, and he draws an analogy between the shackles of debt slavery outlawed by Solon and the technological shackles on the individual that reduce freedom, even if consented to, by commodifying and exploiting people as data. The historian Cynthia Farrer, in looking at what can be learnt from Athenian democracy, and referring to the dichotomy between public and private freedom, opines that our commitment to one kind of equality, individual rights, and human potential gets in the way of our ability to achieve another, political capacity and access to power. And Constant himself warned of the danger to modern societies from the importance placed on individual liberty at the expense of public liberty. He said, the danger of modern liberty is that, absorbed in the enjoyment of our private independence and in the pursuit of our particular interests, we should surrender our right to share in political power too easily. How to remedy the surrender of political power in representative democracies is the concern of deliberative democracy advocates. It's examined by David Honourable in his memorably titled Against Elections. He argues, as do other deliberative Democrats, that representative democracy is seriously undermined by being limited to elections. referring to Rousseau's famous observation that it's a deception to fancy you are free when your voice counts for nothing once elections are completed. Deliberative Democrats argue the Athenian-inspired approaches of sortition and citizen assemblies have continued relevance and utility. Some argue that technological innovations will provide a greater opportunity for institutional change through greater use of opinion sampling and referenda. But without informed discussion and deliberation, such processes miss the valuable lesson that can be learned from the Athenians about the value of civic education, civic engagement, and aggregation of knowledge to build a cohesive collection. Susskind has argued in favour of deliberative approaches in answering questions about how modern democracies can resolve difficult policy issues in the technological revolution. For example, the design of algorithms to reduce error and injustice. Yet there are still those, such as Jason Brennan, who advocate for the limiting of the political power of modern day demos, contending that political power should rest with knowledgeable elites and experts, dismissing concerns that this would lead to the risk of elite capture and not necessarily result in any better decision making. In the narrow corridor, Darren Acemoglu and James Robertson, two of last year's Nobel Prize winners, examine how and why democracy is achieved. Liberty, they argue, is not given by states or controlling elites and depends on society's ability to hold its own against those forces. Both the state and society must be strong with the ability to cooperate and compete for liberty to flourish. This process of contestation is likened to travelling along a long corridor, and a narrow one at that. Remaining in it requires a difficult balancing act. This competitive race is described as the Red Queen effect, taken from a comment of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. So, some final words. A cursory glance at Athenian democracy reinforces that democracy and the values of equality and liberty that define it are neither a natural nor an inevitable order. Its institutional structures must evolve to counter threats and pressures from within and without. Modern democracy can learn from the Athenians that democracy requires an engaged citizenry that values civic participation as a privilege rather than a burden and looks to the collective good as an integral part of the modern social bargain. The difficult journey of democracy requires not only an acknowledgement of these truths, but a commitment to them and to ensuring new generations are equipped with the knowledge and skills needed to sustain democracy. Thank you for your attention.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, Anthe. That was a most engaging presentation. It gives me a distinct privilege to introduce Justice Andromache Karakatsanis. I'm confident that since birth, or at least since your christening, you were destined to be a judge. Why do I say that? I say that because the beautiful name Andromache, it literally means Andras, man, Machi, battle. Literally a fighter of men, but more aptly, a fighter of just causes. And Justice Karakatsanis is the longest serving Justice on the Supreme Court of Canada. Anotato Dicasterio του Canada. She's been a judge for over 14 years on the Supreme Court. Her judicial life commenced in 2002. She first served as a trial judge of the Ontario Court of Justice, and then of the Court of Appeal, my apologies. Before her appointment to the bench, she worked in the justice system in various capacities over a period of almost 20 years. She was a lawyer in private practice, a chair and CEO of a regulatory tribunal. She was Secretary of Native Affairs for Ontario and Deputy Minister of Justice and Deputy Attorney General of Ontario. She subsequently served as Deputy Minister to the Premier, Clerk of the Privy Council and Head of the Ontario Public Service, provided leadership Deputy Ministers to over 60,000 public servants. Throughout her career, Justice Karakatsanis has volunteered extensively and served on boards of many community and professional associations. She is recognised with numerous medals, awards in her professional community work. She currently serves as the chair of the National Action Committee on Access to Justice in Civil and Family Matters. I'm proud to say Justice Karakatsanis is one of the highest ranking judges of Hellenic descent in the diaspora. She's received 4 honorary doctorates. She frequently speaks with pride, megali perifania, of her Greek heritage. In 2015, the President of the Hellenic Republic bestowed her the distinction of the Grand Commander of the Order of Honour. Would you please make Justice Andromache Karakatsanis most welcome?
Efkaristo, Joe. It's great to be in a place where people can say Andromache, Andromache Karakatsanis. I've spent my life trying to teach people how to say my name properly. Kalimera. It's a great honor to be here, surrounded by so many distinguished Hellenic and Philhellenic jurists. I have always been very proud of my Greek heritage. My husband and I were founding members of the Hellenic Canadian Legal Association, Lawyers Association, in the early 1980s. And Tom Carvanis, my husband, is an honorary director of the HCLA. So we're very proud to represent Canada here today. Thank you for that. I want to thank George Sapantis and the New York Bar Association for inviting us, Hal for welcoming us and including us in their family for a second time, and the Greek and Cypriot Lawyer Associations for their warm philoxenia. So when I appeared before the Legislative Committee on my nomination to the Supreme Court of Canada, and when I was sworn in as a justice of 14 years ago, I spoke of the importance of my Greek heritage. Είμαι πολύ επερήφανη που είμαι Ελληνίδα. I love the Greek culture, the ideals of justice, freedom, community, and the Greek kefi, that zest for life. My Greek roots have shaped me and they have served me well as a lawyer, as a community volunteer, as a public servant, and as a judge. Our Greek heritage is also at the root of our Western civilization. In her 1930 book, The Greek Way, Edith Hamilton, a renowned classicist, marveled at the, quote, calm lucidity of the Greek mind, unsurpassed in its mastery of truth and enlightenment. She talked about the genius of ideas that have survived millennia and shaped the Western world. Quote, we are their descendants, intellectually, artistically, politically. It is this Hellenic legacy that allows us to live together in freedom and harmony. I feel especially privileged to speak about democracy here in Athens, While much has changed since the time of Pericles, some of the challenges faced by democratic societies today would be familiar to him. How do we protect the rule of law? How do we ensure justice? How do we encourage meaningful public participation? Ancient Athenian democracy emerged as a radical experiment in political equality. As Justice Philippides has so commandingly explained, Athens proposed something astonishingly different, that the people would share in the governance of the state directly. This was a revolutionary shift, the first time in history. Athens was truly a participatory democracy. Unlike modern democracies where we cast a vote every few years, the citizen assembly met regularly to debate and vote on major decisions of war, law, public policy. Leadership was temporary and directly accountable. Courts were forums as well for the people themselves. The Alieia, the Athenians' people courts, were staffed by citizen jurors chosen by lot. Much like the jury system in common law countries, the ancient Athenian juries ensured that legal authority also rested with the people. Athens was not only the world's first democracy, but perhaps still its most ambitious. These egalitarian principles, however, were bounded by the prejudices of its times. Women, slaves, foreigners were excluded from the demos. And yet, within the democratic culture were many of the ideals we honor today: freedom, equality, justice, and civic duty. These ideals can help safeguard our own democracies. I would like to draw on 3 lessons from Pericles' democracy that are especially relevant today. The first is that the rule of law is essential to the preservation of democracy. The second is that the rule of law is empty without justice. And the third is that a true democracy requires political discourse and robust civic participation. Each of these pillars, law, justice, and participation, is vulnerable. Each must be protected, renewed, and at times reinvented. Each exists not only in texts and precedents, but in the lived realities of people in our communities, in our courtrooms, in our streets. Today, we recognize the legitimacy of democratic decisions depends not only on election results, but on whether they honor core principles such as legality, liberty, equality, and justice. So first, the rule of law is essential to democracy. It is the cornerstone of a free and democratic society. It means that no one is above the law. It shapes the relationships between people and the state. It provides order for a civil society, a predictable means for the peaceful resolution of disputes, and it protects citizens against arbitrary state action. In one of my court's most cited cases, Ron Corelli and Duplessis, we held that state authority cannot be exercised arbitrarily or for improper purposes. Quote, in public regulation, there is no such thing as absolute and untrammeled discretion. Discretion necessarily implies good faith in discharging public duty. The Athenians recognized that democracy requires deep and abiding respect for the rule of law, not just majority rule, but law rooted in stable process, fairness, and the protection of all. In the summer of 355 BCE, an Athenian lawgiver named Timocrates proposed a law that would allow debtors to avoid paying their debts by finding sureties. Concerned jurists brought a graphi paranomon, a charge for unlawful legislation. The celebrated orator Demosthenes argued that such a law, even if passed by majority vote, undermined the rule of law itself. In other words, the law went against the authority of the courts and struck at the very heart of Athenian legal stability and democratic accountability. This story reminds us that the rule of law is not a constraint on democracy. It is what makes democratic governance possible. It is no coincidence, then, when autocratic leaders rise, often their first target is the bar and the judiciary, manipulating legal frameworks, diminishing procedural protections, co-opting judicial appointments, can chip away at judicial independence until the rule of law itself collapses. Hitler used the democratic institutions to gain power, then systematically set out to undermine the public institutions that held government to account. Lawyers, judges, media were weakened and co-opted. The importance of an independent judiciary was on display in Poland in January 2020. After years of systemic attacks on the judiciary, a new law permitted the government to remove judges for political activity, which included decisions that criticized the state. 30,000 lawyers and judges marched in Warsaw wearing their robes, dignified and silent, in a powerful defense of the rule of law. In a thriving democracy, independent lawyers and judges defend the rule of law in the courtroom. As a judge who served at 3 levels of courts, I've seen firsthand how individuals can peacefully challenge state action for conformity to the law and the Constitution. Of course, the independent judiciary must respect the roles of the executive and elected officials. But the separation of powers between the judiciary, the legislature, and executive is essential, but it implies a respectful balance, not a hierarchy. Each branch has overlapping and complementary responsibilities. Each branch is essential. And no branch is above the law, not judges, not government. Examples from around the world remind us that the rule of law can be fragile. Fortunately, in Canada, the rule of law is protected not only by a strong legal culture, but also by constitutional commitments. Through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our judiciary is tasked with safeguarding the rights and freedoms of all, quote, subject only to limits demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. Constitutional rights are sometimes politically unpopular or inconvenient, and that is why the courtroom often serves as a bulwark against the erosion of those rights, especially for the vulnerable. I can share an example that I experienced of seeing the rule of law in action. It's a story about the checks and balances necessary to protect the dignity of everyone within a democracy. It is about the evolution of same-sex rights in Canada. Canada had a long history of discrimination based on sexual orientation. However, in the 1990s, courts across the country held that sexual orientation was protected by equality rights. In the case of M versus H, a woman sought spousal support on the breakdown of a long-term same-sex relationship. She challenged the definition of common law spouse in Ontario, which was restricted to a union between a man and a woman. The Supreme Court held that the exclusion of same-sex couples from spousal support was discriminatory and violated the equality guarantees in the Charter. The court suspended the declaration of invalidity, however, to give the legislature time to enact a new definition of spouse. So I was deputy minister in Ontario when M versus H was released, and that is a public service position, not an elected one in Canada. Even though the case focused on a single definition in a single piece of legislation, it had ramifications for many laws that excluded same-sex couples, such as pension, tax benefits, adoption eligibility. Ontario responded by amending 67 statutes to give same-sex partners the same rights and benefits as unmarried opposite-sex partners. The name of the bill that the reluctant lawmakers chose, changes required by the Supreme Court decision in M versus H. In other words, the Supreme Court made us do it. So next, it was the federal government drafted a law giving same-sex couples equal rights to marry, and they sent it to the Supreme Court for a reference. The court confirmed its validity, rejecting a definition of marriage that would be frozen as it existed at the time of the formation of Canada. Our Constitution instead is, quote, like a living tree, capable of growth and expansion within its natural limits. In 2005, Parliament passed the legislation and same-sex marriage was recognized across the country. This story demonstrates how the separation of powers strengthens, not hinders, democratic governance. Courts identified constitutional failings. Legislatures responded. What emerged was not a clash, but a dialogue between institutions. It is precisely this kind of structured, accountable, and responsive legal process that gives the rule of law its democratic legitimacy. This was a highly charged legal and public policy issue, but the public accepted the decisions and accepted the legitimacy of the courts to make them. That legitimacy is essential for the rule of law to succeed in preserving democracy. This brings me to the second lesson from Pericles' Democracy. The rule of law is empty without justice. Its legitimacy is premised on society's perception of the law as a tool of justice. Law without justice is order without a soul. Socrates, the great philosopher, was condemned under Athenian law for impiety and corrupting the youth. Although he could have fled the city, he chose to submit himself to the court and accept his death sentence. For Socrates, integrity under the law mattered more than life itself. But his death reminds us that legality alone is not justice. One of Canada's most sober legal reckonings came with the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II. Although military and police authorities had concluded there was no threat, the federal government relied on emergency powers under a War Measures Act to forcibly uproot over 23,000 people, most of them Canadian citizens, based solely on their ancestry. At the war's end, the government ordered the deportation of thousands, even of those born in Canada, to a country many had never seen. This led to a case before the Supreme Court of Canada in 1946. The core question was whether the government could, under emergency legislation, deport its own citizens on racial grounds. While the court's decision was divided, a majority upheld at least some of this law. The case remains a haunting example that legality alone is no guarantee of justice. Today, most people see that episode as a shameful chapter in our history, legitimized through law but bereft of justice. To borrow the words of Martin Luther King Jr., it's only when the law bends the arc of history towards justice, that the rule of law becomes just. He also said, never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. As Aristotle said, at his best, man is the noblest of all animals. Separated from law and justice, he is the worst. These words echo through time to remind us that legality alone is not enough. The legitimacy of the law depends on its capacity to serve justice. After almost 23 years as a judge, I have come to believe that the most important judicial quality is humanity. Ultimately, the law is about people. As judges, we must bring our independence of thought with humility of spirit, recognizing that justice is a common good and a basic human right. So how do we maintain these individual freedoms and justice and public values? Pericles' respect for freedom and equality is an enduring ideal. As a former Chief Justice of my court put it, a free society is one which aims at equality with respect to the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms. Freedom must surely be found in respect for the inherent dignity and in the inviolable rights of the human person. But maintaining individual freedom, as Anthe has really outlined so well, comes with the obligation of civic responsibility to engage in public debate and scrutiny, to question, to hold our institutions accountable, and that requires the participation of the public. It requires vigilance from all. So that brings me to the third lesson. True democracy requires robust civil participation. Democracy is obviously not merely about voting. As Pericles said of ancient Greece, quote, "Our ordinary citizens, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public matters. Instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block in the way of action, we think it indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all." Athenian democracy relied on the sustained engagement of ordinary people in public life. This foundational idea remains essential today. While we may no longer gather in the agora, civic participation is what gives democracy its strength, its resilience, and its legitimacy. It is the sharing of ideas, the exchanges of perspectives, deliberation about the common good that gives a vote meaning. In modern representative democracies, the right to vote carries with it the right to speak, the right to listen, and to be informed. Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin of my court, former chief, put it this way in one of her decisions. In the democracy of ancient Athens, all citizens were able to meet and discuss the issues of the day in person. In our modern democracy, we cannot speak personally with each of our fellow citizens. We can convey our message only through methods of mass communication. Civic participation today depends on open, accessible, and protected public discourse. So earlier this year, our court spoke about the importance of political discourse in a case called Working Families. Ontario had passed a law limiting how much non-political actors could spend on political advertising for a full year before the election. Political parties faced no such limits over the first half of that year and a more generous limit in the second. The result we found was a dramatic imbalance. Public interest groups, unions, churches, corporations, and public advocacy organizations were substantially silenced for a full quarter of the legislative cycle, during a time that the legislature was debating public policy and voting on laws. Civil society groups and unions challenged the law, alleging that it violated the right to vote, and our court agreed. The limits, we said, were so disproportionate that they interfered with a fair and balanced political discourse and undermined citizens' ability to hear diverse perspectives. It was my privilege to write those reasons for the majority, and we said that the right to vote must be guided by the ideal of a free and democratic society. We struck down the law as unconstitutional. Now, a similar issue had arisen many decades prior, before individual rights and freedoms were entrenched in our Constitution. During the Great Depression, the province of Alberta, frustrated by critical reporting in the press, passed the Accurate News and Information Act, requiring newspapers to publish government-approved rebuttals alongside any article the government deemed inaccurate or unfair. Failure to comply could result in bans on publication. It was an attempt to suppress criticism and control public dialogue, it was said. The legislation was challenged and ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court. Several justices wrote that freedom of expression and the free circulation of political ideas are foundational to Canada's democracy. Quote, free public discussion is the breath of life for our parliamentary institutions. So even without a Bill of Rights, the court recognized that suppressing dissent and controlling information can be incompatible with democracy. It reaffirmed the need for open public discourse, especially when it involves criticism of those in power. Freedom of speech is vital to a free and democratic society, and today public discourse is shaped by new tools and new challenges. Social media platforms, as we've heard, misinformation, state-sponsored narratives complicate our informational environment. But the underlying principle remains unchanged. Citizens must be able to discern truth through open dialogue. They must be able to hear one another and to speak without fear. Civic participation is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It requires education, media freedom, equal access to platforms, and legal protections. It requires that we nurture democratic habits, not only in formal institutions, but in schools, workplaces, and in our homes. So let me end where I began. Democracy endures not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. It endures when we uphold the rule of law, but not uncritically. It endures when we pursue justice, even when it is unpopular or uncomfortable. It endures when we protect voices that others seek to silence. It endures when society is engaged, watchful, vigilant, and when strong public institutions stand up and defend their ideals. Democracy is not static. It must be exercised, defended, and renewed. In Athens, democracy was an experiment. Today, it is a promise, fragile, urgent, and vital. As heirs to Pericles, let us do all that we can to defend a just rule of law and democracy in our own countries and around the world. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Efcharistopoulou.